Hi, my name is Ember Kelly, and I'm the Director of Religious Education at Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York. And I'm excited to have you join us tonight for our first of the year of our In Conversation series. Our guest tonight is Alec Gewirtz, and I'm really excited to have him on. We've had also a great podcast conversation on our podcast, and I just think he's got some great studies, great information, lots of knowledge to really be able to share with us. And I'm really excited for this conversation tonight. So, Alec, why don't you go ahead and tell us about yourself, tell us about your work and your experiences. What brings you here today?
Yeah, sure thing. And I'm really happy to be joining all you tonight. And I'm grateful that you joined pre-debate as a little warm up to that. We'll try to be a little bit less feisty than I imagine the two of them will be. Um, I create values-based communities for non-religious people, particularly non-religious young people. And I've also been working with people with disabilities since I was a teenager. I studied religion at Princeton, and then I got a Fulbright fellowship to study the theology of disability in Toronto. So how Christians understand disability. And while I was there, I lived and worked full time in a very special faith-based community where people with and without intellectual disabilities live together as peers in sort of outwardly ordinary suburban houses. Um, I can talk more about all of that, but that's it in brief.
Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on some of what you studied in terms of your areas of study while at both Princeton and University of Toronto?
Yeah. So I'm interested mainly in how non-religious people might develop parallel beliefs and practices to religious people, particularly in doing the extraordinary things that some devoutly religious people can bring themselves to do. So I was living for the past year, as I said, at this originally Catholic faith-based community where I was living with a former Franciscan monk, a near priest who left seminary to devote his life to this community, and a woman who belonged to a religious order that I'd never heard of called the Order of Consecrated Virginity. So these are women like nuns who take a vow of chastity, but unlike nuns, live in sort of general society and do things like live in this community with people with disabilities. Um, so what I'm ultimately interested in is the sort of lived experience of how these devoutly religious people generate the motivation to do the very difficult work of, for example, living day in and day out in solidarity with people with severe disabilities. And then what sort of parallel structures of motivation might be for non-religious people like me.
Yeah, thanks. I think that gets to it, which actually relates to the next thing that I was going to ask you about. Could you just tell us a little bit more in depth about this experience of living in its larch?
Exactly. Yeah.
You know,
Just French.
my French is a little rusty. So, could you tell us a little bit more about how exactly that works? What that was like for you? Maybe some big takeaways from that for you?
Yeah, for sure. So I lived in a house with five people with a range of severe disabilities. A nonverbal man who couldn't talk or understand when he was spoken to, a blind woman who spent most of her day in a room in an imaginary conversation with a Canadian pop star. Um, People with a variety of disabilities, and essentially I was living there as a caretaker, doing, bathing, helping people with toileting. But the heart of the community is developing friendships across outward difference, and from a sort of uh, place of vulnerability, openness with weakness, bonding. with people very deeply. So I came to be incredibly, incredibly close to my housemates. And it was a really magical experience. But I mean, I guess to answer your question a little bit more specifically, the day would be, I'd wake up, I'd help people out of bed, help people toileting, bathing, doing the sort of basic self-care stuff. And we do activities during the day. We eat our meals at a common table. And ultimately, we kind of thought of ourselves as a kind of new family. These were people who, in a lot of circumstances, felt abandoned by their families for one reason or another. In my house in particular, a number of people felt that siblings had turned their backs on them, and they just didn't understand why their brother lives in that nice house with the loving spouse and those kids. And so these people, my housemates, were struggling with a real sense of abandonment, and in that context, trying to create a new sort of family in the house. It was super emotionally intense. I can tell tons of stories about it, but that's the basics.
Yeah, no, thanks. So our congregation, Fourth Universalist, is big on justice. So I wonder if you could maybe touch on a little bit, like in the context of this, living in a community where it's both abled and disabled people living together. That you're helping them, but you're building relationships and working on seeing each other as peers and equals. What does justice in terms of thinking about how that can maybe play out in our wider society? Like, what kind of maybe takeaways did you have from that experience there as to how we can then move some of those lessons into our wider society to be more of an accessible society?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I need to acknowledge that, of course, as someone without disabilities, any effort to seek justice should begin with centering the voices of people with disabilities. And in cases where people need help and letting their voices be centered, it demands deep, deep listening, attunement to different people, to a different person's rhythms and ways of communicating. I found that on a second-to-second basis, my housemates frankly wanted more than justice. They wanted love, they wanted companionship, they wanted people who were willing to practice the patience of attuning themselves to their slower rhythms. They wanted sort of open presences who weren't going to run away from outward displays of weakness that might bother some people, moaning or what have you. I remember very vividly, I went to a community center not far from the house, and there was sort of a board with the question, what makes a welcoming community? And the only answer on it related to people with disabilities was ramps. And of course, ramps are essential, and we need ramps, but to be truly welcoming to people with disabilities, we need so much more than that. And ultimately, I can't help but think that what we need is a sort of personal attitude, a sort of refusal to run away from weakness in oneself and in another person, and a willingness to sort of respond to, at least in my house, cries for love by people who lived for so long feeling rejected by society, or even more devastatingly rejected within their families. Does that answer the question? Or
Yeah, I think it really, it gets at it. I think, people are looking to be understood by others. People are interested in feeling like they matter, and I think that those are true in our wider society as well. That people feel disenfranchised. People feel like their voices are not heard, that they're ignored, that they're cut off from what matters. Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of lessons there, and as you said, definitely always vital to be centering the voices of the marginalized as we seek justice. A lot of truth there. So, the theme of September's religious education theme is self-understanding, which is part of our a broader effort to kind of this fall talk about resiliency. How do we be resilient in tough times? Which we're definitely maybe in some tough times. But with self-understanding being the topic, you touched on it a little bit there with like thinking about how you had to deal with the concept of weakness. How did that experience, as well as maybe just also your wider studies, how's that shaped your own journey for understanding yourself?
Yeah, I mean, in really major ways. I mean, first, I came to large a place of intellectual disability from a family and cultural context of what some might call, the intellectual elite. I had just come from Princeton University. My dad's a professor at Yale University. My brother was a Rhodes Scholar who was teaching at Harvard University. And so I very much grew up in a family and a context of intellectual achievement, pursuing status, important positions, and central to the experience was discovering what maybe is a cliche, but certainly an example of a cliche that became a cliche because it's true. And that's that I really did find that the truest and richest humanity I had in me came by leaving that all outside and discovering the sort of luminous, I mean, the beauty in just in relating from a place of weakness, as well as the inward peace of not constantly running away from your weakness, living with sort of shame that people in these contexts, these judgmental contexts of a, elite university or whatever, will discover those weaknesses and reject you for them. Just tons of lessons about coming to peace with my own weakness and the sort of experiential wisdom that my housemates taught me about how just the richest, best life is one where one doesn't run from one's weakness and lives with sort of sensitivity to the possibilities of human tenderness. I mean, so much else as well, but yeah.
Oh, so your studies is largely about like thinking about meaning. How would you say that like that experience in the context of that experience being part of your studies, how did it kind of help you in understanding like meaning in your own life, like thinking about like purpose and meaning, these big concepts that lots of people struggle with in their own lives. How did interacting with people who, like you said, they didn't maybe care who your family was, or this is people who just want to know whether you are willing to respect them and care for them. So I guess, how did it kind of shape your own search for meaning?
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, I can only speak to my own idiosyncratic experience. What I will say, speaking frankly, is that the depth of love that eventually overcame me for my housemates who initially frightened me. There was one housemate who I came to be really, really close friends with, who, when I first arrived at the house, was shrieking at women who rebuffed his romantic advances and slamming doors and brandishing his fist and following me around the house and pelting me with tons of questions, sort of incessant anxiety. For instance, he had a crush on Melania Trump and would just follow me around the house all day asking when he would meet Melania Trump, when Melania Trump chose to marry him, when Melania Trump, and I would just sort of feel contaminated by this anxiety. Anyway, these people who initially frightened me, I sort of viscerally repelled from on some level. I I remember at one point, this person I've just been talking about, he was on one night, shrieking at housemates again, women who had sort of rejected him, and he was shrieking at them, and we gave him space to sort of regain his composure in our living room. And I came into the room, and he was sort of crying and covering his face and saying, "I can't help it. I can't help it. It's my mom. I can't help it." And I said something like, "I understand, but, people really get frightened when you yell at them like that." And then he said, "I can't help it. I have nobody." And the depth, that was a transformative moment in our relationship. And I'll get to the meaning in one second, but to the self-understanding bit, shattered almost in an instant the sort of self-focused insistence on comfort that had basically caused me to repel from him by not wanting to feel the anxiety of being around him, or not wanting to be frightened by the loud noises or whatever. The reason that I bring all that up when it comes to meaning, and again, this is just my idiosyncratic take on it in my own life, the depth of love that eventually arose in me for this housemate of mine, I can't understand it in strict evolutionary terms, thinking, he isn't a member of my family. He isn't a romantic prospect. He's not, a member of, some sort of, cooperative unit that would have been necessary for, the first Homo sapiens to survive. And, frankly, people with disabilities would have been, a kind of like dead weight on those original tribes that were, there doesn't seem to be an easy evolutionary explanation for the depth of love that has overcome me for my housemate. So I can't help but go from that to having that in some way seem to suggest that there's a purpose to reality above a sort of reductive materialist understanding of things. That's just my honest answer to the question. I'm not here to proselytize or convince anyone of that, but yeah.
Thanks. I appreciate the honesty. I think it sounded great. And honestly, it actually it works out well towards the next question that I had ready for you was thinking about both your studies, and it seems relevant to your experiences here. Thinking about meaning, thinking about our lives. Do you think that there's kind of is it part of what it means to be human, and maybe in a non-reductive way, to have this desire to be in community, to have companionship? What is that? Do you think that that's part of what it means to be human? Do you think that that's part of our search for meaning? Do you think what is that drive for community and companionship? How do you think that relates to kind of your thinking about how we create meaning in our lives?
Obviously, it's central to a meaningful life to live in relationship with others. I suppose the only insight from my experiences that I have is I did feel as though I ran up against this sort of, what the Christians I lived with would call a sort of yearning for perfect love, a sort of desire for an endless amount of love that no human relationship can satisfy. So in the case of the man I referenced, he had lost his mom, and he was desperate for a romantic partner, and he sort of seemed to long for this idealized image of a mom or an idealized spouse, this sort of all-loving, all-forgiving person who can look you in the eyes and say, "You're the most important person in the world to me." And a big part in the community was essentially coming to peace with the fact that community members couldn't meet that endless need for love, that need for sort of idealized love that the Christians I lived with, would say only God can satisfy. And in essence, the most beautiful moments in the community might have been ones in which, despite all of our limitations, despite the fact that, I couldn't be this guy's mom, I couldn't be his romantic partner, I was friends with 5 other people in the house, he wasn't going to be the sole object of my attention, and he wasn't going to be, I wasn't going to be the sole object of his attention either. But that nonetheless, our relationship could be enough to nourish us. And that did sort of feel like the central miracle of community, is taking limited relationships, community relationships, aren't familial relationships, they aren't, romantic relationships, they have limitations, but nonetheless, the nourishment in them can be enough. That seemed deeply meaningful to me. If that answers the question, I mean, I guess like more directly, I think most people would say that people have a desire to be embedded in a social structure that's larger than the family unit, or a one-on-one romantic relationship, and that those things become stifling if we don't have that sense of belonging outside of those limited units. So to that extent, I think needing belonging in a wider community is totally essential to how we function.
Oh, I think that sounded beautiful. We hit on it a little bit in the podcast, talking about um, your studies about self-understanding, self-actualization, and such, and your studies about how do we create meaning in our lives. So I suppose could you share with us a little bit about like your studies and your current work and future work in terms of what does that look like? What are your interests? What are your what are you thinking about with meaning and meaning for non-religious folks and community? Like, would you just want to share a little bit about what's going on currently and some of the things you're working on?
Yeah, for sure. So I want to devote my life, as I said at the beginning, to creating values-based communities for non-religious people, people who don't go to church, don't go to synagogue, but still want a moral anchoring, want structures of personal growth, want a community of accountability that can help them in that process of personal growth. As an undergrad at Princeton, I created a community that grew to over 100 weekly members. We had weekly meetings where people were able to reflect and engage on how to build a more fulfilling life. And I'm still doing tons of work in that space, and that is really what I want to do over the long term. I'm writing a book now about the lessons of sharing life with people with disabilities. Doing a bunch of different things, but yeah.
So I wonder, with the heck of a year that 2020 has been, uh, um, because to time frame wise, when did you end your time at
So I
Arch?
started last summer, and I mean, not of course this, but like summer of 2019, and was there until the spring when I had to leave because of COVID stuff.
Okay, yeah. Uh, so things were disrupted a little bit by
For sure,
COVID.
yeah.
You would have been there for longer,
And I am
had,
going back as soon as I'm
yeah,
able to,
as
but
soon as you're able to. Complications of the American Canadian border right now. Um, so I suppose having to deal with that, to deal with leaving, but also just with uh, the relentless barrage that COVID and this year has kind of been. How has that kind of shaped your thoughts about uh, searching for meaning in the midst of a year that lots of people really are searching for meaning because they feel like that COVID is breaking down so much of what they've ever understood about life and about their expectations of the world around them. So I suppose has COVID it's obviously shaped your studies as you were just sharing, but it shaped kind of your thinking? Do you have any maybe insights to how we can find meaning even in these challenging times?
yeah, I mean, the first thing I can't help but think is like, um, we shouldn't get, too abstract and intellectual when like there's not much profound meaning to be found in the fact that like governmental incompetence has caused huge amounts of people to die in this country who didn't have to die, and like full stop on that. Nonetheless, it's certainly the case that the virus has forced people to, confront their fragility, by isolating them, force them to sort of come face to face with all these aspects of themselves that they might have tried to escape in the hectic day-to-day routine of life, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of my own work, there are basically two schools of thought among people who are trying to do sort of innovative community work, creating sorts of new community venues. And one of them is that post-COVID, people are going to be, hungry for innovative, modes of socializing. So, religiously unaffiliated young people like me will suddenly, be willing, just because they're so exhilarated to get, back out in the world, they'll be willing to do all sorts of, communal experiences that they might not have done. Then there's the other school of thought, which is that like people have been deprived of hanging out with their friends indoors, and like all they'll want when COVID's over is like to be able to hang out with their friends indoors, and that this won't sort of be the beginning of an enormous flowering of innovative communities. So I think a bit about that. And I suppose like the third thing about this, and something that we did sort of touch on in the podcast, but I do think it's forced people to confront some of the big issues of life, like their fragility, their vulnerability in nature, whatever. And it underscores the need for these sorts of innovative communities to meet religiously unaffiliated people. It underscores the need for those communities to actually speak to people's deepest struggles. So many of these communities that emerge, as I talked about in the podcast, some people in, religious studies at various schools will say that, people are, finding community structures of personal growth and stuff outside of a traditional religious context that are nonetheless, nourishing a lot of the parts of themselves that religious communities are traditionally nourished. And they'll point, to a CrossFit gym, and a CrossFit gym, it, provides a really strong community. It provides an incredible structure for personal growth. And as a result, people have this sort of like missionary evangelical zeal in telling people about it, and trying to bring them in. And what I can't help but say, and what I think a period like this that shakes people so deeply can't help but make sort of obvious, is that of course those communities have profound value. And it's certainly not my position, when I basically don't have much exposure to CrossFit, to like hate on CrossFit. But people also have to be honest about what these communities aren't doing, and what the people who lead these communities aren't trained to do. And they're aspects of the human that we can't just think are going to be met outside of traditional religious context. And instead, we need to think deeply about what those aspects of us are, and what creative ways of meeting them might be when so many young people aren't going to church and to similar venues.
I know you say young people there, so maybe as a side question, I guess, do you think that there's do you think there's an age divide in this the growth of the nuns, not in the NUN sense, but the NONE sense? Do you think that there's an age gap there, or do you also find that maybe older folks are also struggling to maybe find communities that fit? Maybe they've been jaded or hurt by religion as well. Do you think
Yeah,
that
there's
there's yeah?
certainly tons of older people, and obviously like the movement of secularization in the United States obviously has a long history. The stats point to there being a greater percentage of young people who fall into that camp of religious nuns. I mean, Pew puts out this religious landscape survey, and the numbers are pretty clear, but certainly there are tons of older folks who are also struggling with this sort of thing. And, the need for intergenerational community also is huge. And I don't think that, communities that try to speak in particular to non-religious young people should be exclusionary of older people. In truth, something that I couldn't stop thinking about while I was at L'Arche was how the placement of elderly in old age homes is a form of institutionalization, in a sense that produces a very similar sense of abandonment to that experienced by people with disabilities in prior generations. So the need for intergenerational community is huge. And I think that definitely sort of innovative community spaces that speak to non-religious young people can include older ones too.
Definitely. And some definite truth there about institutionalization. We think that that's been really laid bare with Corona. Um, so if you two kind of closing things for you here from me before we open up to general questions. If you had unlimited, endless resources, what would you want to do in terms of working to create like a well-functioning, not explicitly religious, but like community for folks that are searching for meaning? What would that kind of look like to you in a perfect world where everything worked correctly and you had infinite money to put it together?
First, if I had infinite money, I don't know if priority number one would be, creating my dream community. But leaving that aside, I also the communities I hope to create are not going to be, one man projects that I sort of, dream up. And obviously it goes without saying that there have been so many examples of male-led, values-based communities that have been incredibly destructive. And the process that I'm embarking on now is very much self-consciously a collaborative one. All of that said, in terms of what, my instinct is that people hunger for, and I think it would be a physical place in American towns or cities where people can come together for both conversation and guidance from older, wiser folks in creating a meaningful life, making all the difficult personal adjustments needed to build that meaningful life, and to sort of find the communal nourishment that is ultimately what sustains people in that process of personal growth. That's all kind of abstract and vague, but in that, lots of people who think about the future of religion will say that the congregational model is dead. People don't want to go to a space. People, want to be fluid and, moving from discrete events, et cetera, et cetera. And I basically am unconvinced by that. I think it's hard to make the case that the reason that there, is low turnout among young people at some traditional religious services is because young people don't like to gather and listen to music, listen to an inspiring message. That doesn't quite make sense to me. So anyway, I basically think that it will resemble in many ways a traditional religious space. But lots of people disagree with me, and I'm so not wedded to that. The space that I created at Princeton, the community I created at Princeton, did sort of function with weekly meetings. It had an optional small group component, like at some churches, but unlike those churches, people would meet in groups of 4 for conversations in which they'd pick an area of their lives in which they want to make an improvement, think through a plan for how to make that improvement, and then get held accountable to living by that plan. So, I mean, I think there's huge amounts of opportunities within what might resemble a congregational model, if that answers the question.
I think that answers it quite well. I mean, it has me thinking about as the new director of religious education, who's only been in this setting for only a few months. Uh, the beauty that I've already found in it being folks from a variety of different backgrounds. So it's just speaking to my own experience there. So last thing before as we end the recording and any YouTube viewers and move into question time, would be, I guess, do you have an elevator pitch if you were gonna give a real quick takeaway for everybody that was the quick elevator pitch about uh, what you've learned and what you would wish to convey to them, I guess, do you have an elevator pitch?
Sure. I mean, I came from a sort of secular humanist background and have gradually come to the view that traditional humanist conceptions of the human are shrunken and that there's so much more to us than I at least was raised to understand in secular society. And there need to be innovative attempts to open up those dimensions of people. And I want to play my part in creating the communities and writings that will help people open up the fullness of who they have it in them to be.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead. We'll end our recording. So thank you to all who have joined afterwards on YouTube. We will see you around. Thank you for stopping in for our video.